Section 4. The Free Men and the Ford Car. I am not a fanatic, and I think that machines may be of considerable use in destroying machinery. I should generously accord them a considerable value in the work of exterminating all that they represent. But to put the truth in those terms is to talk in terms of the remote conclusion of our slow and reasonable revolution. In the immediate situation, the same truth may be stated in a more moderate way. Towards all typical things of our time, we should have a rational charity. Machinery is not wrong, it is only absurd. Perhaps we should say it is merely childish, and can even be taken in the right spirit by a child. If, therefore, we find that some machine enables us to escape from an inferno of machinery, we cannot be committing a sin, though we may be cutting a silly figure, like a dragoon rejoining his regiment on an old bicycle. What is essential to realize is that there is something ridiculous about the present position, something wilder than any utopia. For instance, I shall have occasion here to note the proposal of centralized electricity, and we could justify the use of it, so long as we see the joke of it. But, in fact, we do not even see the joke of the waterworks in the water company. It is almost too broadly comic that an essential of life, like water, should be pumped to us from nobody knows where, by nobody knows whom, sometimes nearly 100 miles away. It is every bit as funny as if air were pumped to us from miles away, and we all walked about like divers at the bottom of the sea. The only reasonable person is a peasant who owns his own well, but we have a long way to go before we begin to think about being reasonable. There are, at present, some examples of centralization of which the effects may work for decentralization. An obvious case is that recently discussed in connection with the common plant of electricity. I think it is broadly true that if electricity could be cheapened, the chance of a very large number of small independent shops, especially workshops, would be greatly improved. At the same time, there is no doubt at all that such dependence for essential power on a central plant is a real dependence, and is therefore a defect in any complete scheme of independence. On this point, I imagine that many distributists might differ considerably, but, speaking for myself, I am inclined to follow the more moderate and provisional policy that I have suggested more than once in this place. I think the first necessity is to make sure of any small properties obtaining any success in any decisive or determining degree. Above all, I think it is vital to create the experience of small property, the psychology of small property, the sort of man who is a small proprietor. When once men of that sort exist, they will decide, in a manner very different from any modern mob, how far the central powerhouse is to dominate their own private house, or whether it need dominate it at all. They will perhaps discover the way of breaking up and individualizing that power. They will sacrifice, if there is any need to sacrifice, even the help of science to the hunger for possession. So that I am disposed at the moment to accept any help that science and machinery can give in creating small property, without in the least bowing down to such superstitions where they only destroy it. But we must keep in mind the peasant ideal is the motive and the goal, and most of those who offer us mechanical help seem to be blankly ignorant of what we regard it as helping. A well-known name will illustrate both the thing being done and the men being ignorant of what he is doing. The other day I found myself in a Ford car, like that in which I remember riding over Palestine, and in which I suppose Mr. Ford would enjoy riding over Palestinians. Anyhow, it reminded me of Mr. Ford, and that reminded me of Mr. Penty and his views upon equality in mechanical civilization. The Ford car, if I may venture on one of those new ideas urged upon us in newspapers, is a typical product of the age. The best thing about it is the thing for which it is despised, that it is small. The worst thing about it is the thing for which it is praised, that it is standardized. Its smallness is, of course, the subject of endless American jokes about a man catching a Ford like a fly, or possibly a flea. But nobody seems to notice how this popularization of motoring, however wrong in motive or in method, really is a complete contradiction to the fatalistic talk about inevitable combination and concentration. The railway is fading before our eyes, birds nesting, as it were, in the railway signals, and wolves howling, so to speak, in the waiting room. And the railway really was a communal and concentrated mode of travel, like that in a utopia of the socialists. The free and solitary traveller is returning, before our very eyes, not always, it is true, equipped with scrip or scallop, but having recovered, to some extent, the freedom of the King's highway, in the manner of Merry England. Nor is this the only ancient thing such travel is revived. While Mugby Junction neglected its refreshment rooms, Hugby in the whole has revived its inns. To that limited extent the Ford motor is already a reversion to the free man. If he has not 3 acres and a cow, he has the very inadequate substitute of 300 miles and a car. I do not mean that this development satisfies my theories, but I do say that it destroys other people's theories. All the theories about the collective thing is a thing of the future, and the individual thing is a thing of the past. Even in their own special and stinking way of science and machinery, the facts are very largely going against their theories. Yet I have never seen Mr. Ford or his little car really and intelligently praised for this. I have often, of course, seen him praised for all the conveniences of what is called standardization. The argument seems to be more or less to this effect. When your car breaks down with a loud crash in the middle of Salisbury Plain, though it is not very likely that any fragments of other ruined motor cars will be lying about amid the ruins of Stonehenge, yet, if they are, it is a great advantage to think that they will probably be of the same pattern, and you can take them to mend your own car. The same principle applies to persons motoring in Tibet, and exulting in the reflection that if another motorist from the United States did happen to come along, it would be possible to exchange wheels or foot brakes in tokens of amity. I may not have got the details of the argument quite correct, but the general point of it is that if anything goes wrong with parts of a machine, they can be replaced with identical machinery. And anyhow, the argument could be carried much further, and used to explain a great many other things. I am not sure that it is not the clue to many mysteries of the age. I begin to understand, for instance, why magazine stories are all exactly alike. It is ordered so that when you have left one magazine in a railway carriage in the middle of a story called Pansy Eyes, you may go on with exactly the same story in another magazine under the title of Dandelion Locks. It explains why all leading articles on the future of the churches are exactly the same, so that we may begin reading the article in the Daily Chronicle and finish it in the Daily Express. It explains why all the public utterances urging us to prefer new things to old never by any chance say anything new. They mean that we should go to a new paper stall and read it in a new newspaper. That is why all American caricatures repeat themselves like a mathematical pattern. It means that when we have torn off a part of the picture to wrap up sandwiches, we can tear off another bit of another picture, and it will always fit in. And this is also why American millionaires all look exactly alike, so that when the bright, resolute expression of one of them has led us to do serious damage to his face with a heavy blow of the fist, it is always possible to mend it with noses and jawbones taken from other millionaires who are exactly similarly constituted. Such are the advantages of standardization, but, as may be suspected, I think the advantages are exaggerated, and I agree with Mr. Penty in doubting whether all this repetition really corresponds to human nature. But a very interesting question was raised by Mr. Ford's remarks on the difference between men and men, and he suggested that most men preferred mechanical action, or were only fitted for it. About all those arguments affecting human equality, I myself have one feeling which finds expression in a little test of my own. I shall begin to take seriously those classifications of superiority and inferiority when I find a man classifying himself as inferior. It will be noted that Mr. Ford does not say that he is only fitted to mind machines. He confesses, frankly, that he is too fine and free and fastidious a being for such tasks. I shall believe the doctrine when I hear somebody say, "I have only got the wits to turn a wheel." That would be real. That would be realistic. That would be scientific. That would be independent testimony that could not easily be disputed. It is exactly the same, of course, with all the other superiorities and denials of human equality that are so specially characteristic of a scientific age. It is so with the men who talk about superior and inferior races. I never heard a man say, "Anthropology shows that I belong to an inferior race." If he did, he might be talking like an anthropologist. As it is, he is talking like a man, and not unfrequently like a fool. I have long hoped that I might some day hear a man explaining on scientific principles his own unfitness for any important post or privilege. Say, the world should belong to the free and fighting races, and not to persons of that servile disposition that you will notice in myself. The intelligent will know how to form opinions, but the weakness of intellect from which I so obviously suffer renders my opinions manifestly absurd on the face of them. There are indeed stately and godlike races, but look at me. Observe my shapeless and fourth-rate features. Gaze, if you can bear it, on my commonplace and repulsive face. If I heard a man making a scientific demonstration in that style, I might admit that he was really scientific. But as it invariably happens, by a curious coincidence, that the superior race is his own race, the superior type is his own type, and the superior preference for work the sort of work he happens to prefer, I have come to the conclusion that there is a simpler explanation. Now, Mr. Ford is a good man, so far as it is consistent with being a good millionaire, but he himself will very well illustrate where the fallacy of his argument lies. It is probably quite true that in the making of motors there are 100 men who can work a motor, and only 1 man who can design a motor. But of the 100 men who could work a motor, it is very probable that 1 could design a garden, another design a charade, another design a practical joke or a derisive picture of Mr. Ford. I do not mean, of course, in anything I say here, to deny differences of intelligence, or to suggest that equality, a thing wholly religious, depends on any such impossible denial. But I do mean that men are nearer to a level than anybody will discover by setting them all to make one particular kind of runabout clock. Now, Mr. Ford himself is a man of defiant limitations. He is so indifferent to history, for example, that he calmly admitted in the witness box that he had never heard of Benedict Arnold. An American who has never heard of Benedict Arnold is like a Christian who has never heard of Judas Iscariot. He is rare. I believe that Mr. Ford indicated in a general way that he thought Benedict Arnold was the same as Arnold Bennett. Not only is this not the case, but it is an error to suppose that there is no importance in such an error. If he were to find himself in the heat of some controversy, accusing Mr. Arnold Bennett of having betrayed the American president and ravaged the South with an anti-American army, Mr. Bennett might bring an action. If Mr. Ford were to suppose that the lady who recently wrote Revelations in the Daily Express was old enough to be the widow of Benedict Arnold, the lady might bring an action. Now, it is not impossible that among the workmen whom Mr. Ford perceives, probably quite truly, to be only suited to the mechanical part of the construction of mechanical things, there might be a man who was fond of reading all the history he could lay his hands on, and who had advanced step by painful efforts of self-education, until the difference between Benedict Arnold and Arnold Bennett was quite clear in his mind. If his employer did not care about the difference, of course, he would not consult him about the difference, and the man would remain to all appearances a mere cog in the machine. There would be no reason for finding out that he was a rather cogitating cog. Anybody who knows anything of modern business knows that there are any number of such men who remain in subordinate and obscure positions because their private tastes and talents have no relation to the very stupid business in which they are engaged. If Mr. Ford extends his business over the solar system and gives cars to the Martians and the men in the moon, he will not be an inch nearer to the mind of the man who is working his machines for him, and thinking about something more sensible. Now, all human things are imperfect, but the condition in which such hobbies and secondary talents do to some extent come out is the condition of small independence. The peasant almost always runs 2 or 3 side shows, and lives on a variety of crafts and expedients. The village shopkeeper will shave travellers, and stuff weasels, and grow cabbages, and do half a dozen such things, keeping a sort of balance in his life like the balance of sanity in the soul. The method is not perfect, but it is more intelligent than turning him into a machine in order to find out whether he has a soul above machinery. Upon this point of immediate compromise with machinery, therefore, I am inclined to conclude that it is quite right to use the existing machines insofar as they do create a psychology that can despise machines, but not if they create a psychology that respects them. The Ford car is an excellent illustration of the question, even better than the other illustrations I have given of the electrical supply for small workshops. If possessing a Ford car means rejoicing in a Ford car, it is melancholy enough. It does not bring us much further than tooting or rejoicing in a tooting tram car. But if possessing a Ford car means rejoicing in a field of corn or clover, in a fresh landscape and a free atmosphere, it may be the beginning of many things, and even the end of many things. It may be, for instance, the end of the car in the beginning of the cottage. Thus, we might almost say that the final triumph of Mr. Ford is not when the man gets into the car, but when he enthusiastically falls out of the car. It is when he finds somewhere, in remote and rural corners that he could not normally have reached, that perfect poise and combination of hedge and tree and meadow in the presence of which any modern machine seems suddenly to look an absurdity, yes, even an antiquated absurdity. Probably that happy man, having found the place of his true home, will proceed joyfully to break up the car with a large hammer, putting its iron fragments for the first time to some real use, as kitchen utensils or garden tools. That is using a scientific instrument in the proper way, for it is using it as an instrument. The man has used modern machinery to escape from modern society, and the reason and rectitude of such a course commends itself instantly to the mind. It is not so with the weaker brethren, who are not content to trust Mr. Ford's car, but also trust Mr. Ford's creed. If accepting the car means accepting the philosophy I have just criticized, the note that some men are born to make cars, or rather small bits of cars, then it will be far more worthy of a philosopher to say frankly that men never needed to have cars at all. It is only because the man had been sent into exile in a railway train that he has to be brought back home in a motor car. It is only because all machinery has been used to put things wrong that some machinery may now rightly be used to put things right. But I conclude upon the whole that it may be so used, and my reason is that which I considered on a previous page under the heading of the chance of recovery. I pointed out that our ideal is so sane and simple, so much in accord with the ancient and general instincts of men, that when once it is given a chance anywhere, it will improve that chance by its own inner vitality, because there is some reaction towards health whenever disease is removed. The man who has used his car to find his farm will be more interested in the farm than in the car, certainly more interested than in the shop where he once bought the car. Nor will Mr. Ford always woo him back to that shop, even by telling him tenderly that he is not fitted to be a lord of land, a rider of horses, or a ruler of cattle, since his deficient intellect and degraded anthropological type fit him only for mean and mechanical operations. If anyone will try saying this, tenderly of course, to any considerable number of large farmers, who have lived for some time on their own farms with their own families, he will discover the defects of the approach.